And we're going to start as we do with our blessing, which is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu La'asok B'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. You sanctify us with commandments, and you command us to immerse ourselves, to participate in the give and take of Torah learning together, to figure out how to apply ancient teachings that we've been talking about for 3,000 years to modern contemporary settings. Judaism is a progressive project, I like to call it, not progressive politically, but progressive in that it is attempting constantly to figure out how to take the past and put it into place today and update it. We are not bound by the past. We are influenced by it. We are learners of it, students of it, as a way of figuring out what to do now. So where we are in this discussion, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, is we are in the middle of a wonderful book called Maimonides and the Book That Changed Judaism, which is by Professor Micah Goodman. And we are looking at what Maimonides has to say about prophecy for the sake of understanding what is perhaps a much more updated theological perspective than one would expect from the Middle Ages. To give you a sense of my motivation on this, I tend to feel that our current theology in conversation in the public sphere is pretty simplistic, and that so simplistic as to be damaging to our ability to talk intelligently and well about the world. And that being the case, it seemed like, since theology at its heart is not necessarily about God per se, but really about how we interact with a world that's filled with things that we don't understand, God becomes a code word for mystery. And what's really interesting in my mind about medieval philosophers like Maimonides is they had a much more nuanced, even maybe secular idea of God than we do as 21st century thinkers. And so using Maimonides as a foil to get us to think about God, the universe, and everything. So that's my intro. And then we're going to jump in, and please don't hesitate along the way to raise your hand, to unmute yourself, to ask questions, and feel free to interrupt. After all, Judaism is about that give and take. And so we are looking at, this is page 31 on God and prophecy in this book, and I'll make it bigger for all of us to see. And we're looking at the power of divination, which is a short section in this book, but it's worth undertaking because it leads us very much into the next parts. Here, Professor Goodman is really leading us through this question of how does prophecy and divination in historic Judaism jibe with Maimonides' rationality? Right, Maimonides is a super rationalist, a Greek, a Neoplatonic Aristotelian philosopher, meaning he has the influence of all of the Greek scholars of the ancient world, updated through the lenses of medieval Muslim scholars. Why not medieval Christian scholars? Because the medieval Christians aren't interested in Greek philosophy. They have decided that Greek philosophy is especially sort of post-Plato, basically anything that is Aristotelian or afterwards is suspect, according to the medieval Catholics. So the height of, call it academic or liberal arts dialogue, is taking place in the Muslim world in the time of Maimonides. So here we've got, so the power of divination. This is Professor Goodman, who's going to immediately quote Maimonides and get us deep into this. Professor Goodman says, here we are, prophecy may also involve the capacity to discern the future. And this is a quote from Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, which is, of course, what Professor Goodman is helping us try to understand. So too, the faculty of divination exists in all people. Think about that. Maimonides is saying everybody gets to participate in divination. And of course, divination in a classic sense is seeing the future. So Maimonides is democratizing this 100%. There is no one who can't access this. But in virtue of the strength of this divination, the mind goes over all the premises and draws from them conclusions in the shortest time, so that it is thought to happen in no time at all. In virtue of this faculty, certain people give warnings concerning great future events. So think about this. The mind goes over all the premises and draws from them conclusions in the shortest time, so that it's thought to happen in no time at all. This is extrapolation and analysis. Maimonides is basically calling divination not mystical prognostication, but educated prediction. For all intents and purposes, Maimonides is calling prophecy weather forecasting, or divination weather forecasting at this point. And Professor Goodman is going to explain this. He says, the power of divination seems a paranormal intuition. The prophet is able to predict future events in a way that is so quick that the rational mind does not appear to be involved in the process at all. But this is an illusion. According to Maimonides, the prophet's power of divination allows them to reflect very rapidly on, next page, on the continuum of past and present events, and thereby draw conclusions about what will happen in the future. This is actually an ordinary intellectual operation. The faculty of divination simply accelerates the work of processing data and drawing inferences. So think about this. This is Professor Goodman analyzing what Maimonides is saying in the 12th century, and Maimonides is saying divination, the process of future prediction, is an intellectual process sped up, not a paranormal or magical or religious process. Think about that. Maimonides is discounting the idea that something supernatural is going on here. There is nothing strange about divination, according to Maimonides. Now, one of my favorite courses of study right now is reading a wonderful scholar who many of you may have heard of, named Daniel Kahneman. This is him. He, Amos Tversky, did the research behind this book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which I highly recommend. But if you don't want to go deep into this, all you need to do is go and find Michael Lewis's book called The Undoing Project. So Michael Lewis is famous. Ben is nodding his head, having heard of Michael Lewis for a lot of things. One of the things Michael Lewis is most famous for is the book Moneyball. Moneyball was a book that analyzed baseball and said, if we were to analyze baseball using real statistics, the statistics that impact game outcomes, we would find that certain things work better than we think. And this led to a number of people like the Oakland A's. He was actually following the Oakland A's, who started analyzing baseball players not on hits and strikeouts and all these other things, but on the impact of their play on the outcome of the game. And it turns out that things like on-base percentages and a whole bunch of other factors were much more important than whether or not somebody had a high batting average or hit home runs in terms of the game, in terms of winning games. And so the Oakland A's used this math thing. This was, by the way, the chronicling of Nate Silver. Everybody's heard of Nate Silver in 538, but Nate Silver first got his start in baseball, reanalyzing baseball and saying, here are all these statistics and we're not using them correctly. We could be using them to talk about whether or not we win games, but instead we use them to talk about whether or not people get hit, players get hits. And that changed the game of baseball, because what used to be a high-priced baseball player wasn't in fact worthwhile because they weren't contributing to wins. And it's what led to the Oakland A's and eventually the Boston Red Sox doing incredibly well with less money buying big name players and more money putting together a team of a winning combination. Michael Lewis then asked the question, how come nobody did this to baseball before? For any of you who know anything about baseball, it is the most statistically analyzed game in the world. So why, with everybody taking stats so seriously for decades, did it take till the early double aughts, to the first part of the 21st century, to somebody to actually do an effective analysis of baseball? And what that led Michael Lewis to was the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two Israeli psychologists who created the field of bias. This is one of my favorite topics of discussion. I will try not to take us on too far a tangent. However, the question of intuition and bias is at the heart of the way our brains function. In other words, most of us do things without thinking all the time. For those of us who have driver's licenses, we do a whole host of things that might be identified in the realm of intuitive divination. For example, if we've driven for more than a couple of years, the likelihood of us thinking about pressing the accelerator or the brake with our foot is irrelevant. We do it naturally. It is unconscious. It is part of our thinking fast. We don't even think about it, it just happens. The more trained up we get in any field, the more thinking fast that happens. So this is a story of thinking fast from Daniel Kahneman's book. And it's on topic for the question of intuition and divination, which I draw the parallel to here. So we're expanding. Oh, somebody has a question. Wonderful. Yes, exactly like muscle memory, only brain muscle memory. The psychologist Gary Klein tells the story of a team of firefighters that entered a house in which the kitchen was on fire. Soon after they started hosing down the kitchen, the commander heard himself shout, "Let's get out of here," without realizing why. The floor collapsed almost immediately after the firefighters escaped. Only after the fact did the commander realize that the fire had been unusually quiet and that his ears had been unusually hot. Together, these impressions prompted what he called a sixth sense of danger. He had no idea what was wrong, but he knew something was wrong. It turned out that the heart of the fire had not been in the kitchen, but in the basement beneath where the men had stood. We have all heard of such stories of expert intuition. The chess master who walks past a street game and announces white mates in 3 without stopping, or the physician who makes a complex diagnosis after a single glance at a patient. Expert intuition strikes us as magical, but it is not. Indeed, each of us performs feats of intuitive expertise many times each day. Most of us are pitch perfect in detecting anger in the first word of a telephone call, recognize as we enter a room that we were the subject of the conversation, and quickly react to subtle signs that the driver of the car in the next lane is dangerous. Our everyday intuitive abilities are no less marvelous than the striking insights of an experienced firefighter or a physician, only more common. So this is at the heart of Daniel Kahneman's thinking with regard to intuition and what he calls thinking fast. That there's a part of our brain that we train to see things more quickly. How is this different from divination? It's not. Maimonides is talking about the same process that he's observing in human reason nearly 900 years ago. And what this, in my mind, says is that, first of all, Maimonides is unparalleled in his brilliance, which we all know. But more importantly, we've been observing the process by which humans think and understand the world for long enough to know that it's possible to train ourselves to see things that are obvious and clear, not only that other people don't see who have different training than we do, but also that we couldn't reason out because our training is so profound. The firefighter who walks into a room and is able to piece together a bunch of signs that he or she knows lead to danger is because they have succeeded as a firefighter for so long that those signs have become part of their intuitive thinking. They are literally prognosticating, divining, predicting what's going to happen next. This is Maimonides' take on divination, that we can predict what will happen next the more expert we are in what's going on around us. This is a very secular human idea of prophecy and in a classic Jewish work. Any thoughts or questions before we move on? Because it's going to get even more rationalist.
Well, Rabbi, I just texted you actually. The word divination comes from the word divine, right?
In English, yes.
So it has to be related to God because divine means coming from God.
But that's not the word that Maimonides is using in Hebrew.
Oh.
And to divine something is not to place God in it per se, but rather to understand something as if one had a godlike awareness, right? Divination, in biblical Hebrew, there are a couple of words for seeing the future, for a seer as opposed to a prophet. And they have nothing to do with God. And Elise says, so this was unusual in those days, meaning accurate predicting was unusual in the Middle Ages, or divination or prophecy. What do you mean?
No, Maimonides' belief was that unusual for the times.
Not among philosophers. So Maimonides is representative of what you would identify as the cream of the crop of philosophers from his time. Steve asks, how does the thinking fast analogy in driving relate to changes in the environment when what we know doesn't apply to new situations? So Tiger Woods driving on a street he never knew in Los Angeles, or drivers in Houston who never drove in snow, so their intuitive thinking doesn't apply. Of course, right. Driving on snow for the first time is a new experience. Our intuition leads us astray. Skidding in the snow while driving is a counterintuitive experience, so much so that there is a Finnish driver's ed program in Finland for driving in snowy conditions. They have a whole, for teenagers to qualify for driving on snow because it's different. Because controlling a skid is different. I had to relearn how to drive on snow once I got anti-lock brakes, because anti-lock brakes pump the brakes for us. So driving in slippery conditions prior to anti-lock brakes meant doing something that many of us might remember, pumping the brakes. But an anti-lock braking system actually does that for us better than we could do on our own. So if we have to stop quickly in a slippery situation, it's better to jam on the brakes because the anti-lock brakes will do it better than we could possibly do it. Bob says, he was my kind of thinker, more like how you solve engineering problems. Absolutely. Basically, think of Maimonides looking at Judaism as the human engineering problem for society. So what exactly is Maimonides claiming so far about God? Well, that's an interesting question, Emma, because Maimonides is focusing on a much more abstract God idea than an interventionist supernaturalist God idea. He is much more comfortable with God as an unknowable architect of reality, who does not intervene or respond to prayers or do all these things, that's not Maimonides' God. By the way, as we've gone through this at certain points, Maimonides throws in more concrete, less abstract ideas of God for the sake of his less advanced audience. He basically writes the Guide for the Perplexed with two audiences in mind: the people who are going to get it and ask questions and not feel threatened by a world with less God presence, and the people who are not going to get it and who want to know, not for you, Bob, because you're not interested, Bob, in a God who controls everything, right? Maimonides doesn't want to run afoul of a traditionalist theologian who feels like God is responding to prayers. But Maimonides knows, like Jewish scholars had known for 1,500 years before him, that the world doesn't work on human level with regard to God. I mean, that's the whole point of the book of Job. The book of Job, written sometime 300 or 400 years before the Common Era, is an antidote to reward and punishment in the Bible. It says, no, reward and punishment doesn't work the way humans understand. I can be a good person and suffer. And the universe doesn't care necessarily about justice from my perspective. So that's in Judaism, but not all Jews are comfortable with that. So Maimonides understands that. What's fascinating to me is that Jewish thinkers have been grappling with a theology that not everybody gets on multiple levels for thousands of years. Here, the prophetic vision, Professor Goodman is going to say even more. And this may be somewhat shocking for us to hear. Maimonides' explanation of prophecy offers a new understanding of a number of scriptural passages. The Torah tells us that Abraham, who was sitting at the entrance to his tent, ran toward three people who were approaching, and without knowing that they were angels, extended extraordinary hospitality. According to Maimonides, the story never actually happened, but rather was all a prophetic vision that took place in Abraham's mind. Prophetic, so this is pretty radical, one might think, for a medieval thinker, but here it is. So this is the quote from Genesis. Maimonides is using a classic Jewish commentary approach. He's quoting from Genesis, and then he's going to comment. So the quote is from Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 2. This is the Parsha Vayera, and they appeared. And it's the opening of this Parsha. And God appeared to Abraham by the tents of Mamre. And Abraham raised his eyes and saw, and behold, three men were standing facing him. So this is the bracket of the two verses. If you want to see what the full text looks like, which seems reasonable, like we ought to see what the full text looks like, right? I'll show you, because it turns out it's not so hard to have that text spooled up for us. So this is, let me show you. For those of you who have not found Sepharia yet, I highly recommend it. Here is Sepharia, right? This is sepharia.org. This is what I was looking at last night with people. So we're not looking at Exodus. We're going to look at, click on Tanakh, click on Genesis, and we are looking at Genesis 18, verses 1 and 2. So look how easy this is to navigate. Here we go, Hebrew and English. This is the full text. Vayera elav. So and God appeared. Vayera elav Adonai be'elanei mamre. And God appeared to him, to Abraham, among the trees or the oaks. The translation that Professor Goodman uses, tents of Mamre, which is a place. V'hu yoshev petach ha'ohel kachom hayom. And he is sitting in the opening of his tent at the heat of the day. Vayisa einav vayar And he lifted up his eyes and he saw the Hine Shlosha Anashim Nitzavim Alav. And here are three people standing upon him, like literally right in his face, as it were. Vayar, and he saw, Vayarotz, and he ran, Likratam, to greet them, Mipetach ha'ohel, from the opening of the tent, Vayishtachu arza, and he bowed to the ground. And then, so those are the full text of those two verses that Professor Goodman is showing us. And here, we go back to Professor Goodman's text so that we continue with Maimonides. So Maimonides quotes those two verses. Obviously, he quotes them with an ellipsis in the middle. So now you have the full text. And here is what Maimonides has to say. For after he had first propounded the proposition that God appeared to him. So once Abraham says, God appears to me, Abraham began to explain what the form of this proposition was. And he said that at first he saw three men and ran. So here, what we have Maimonides doing is explaining that Genesis is recounting Abraham's explanation of his own vision. This is not the author of Genesis telling us what happened. This is the author of Genesis telling us what Abraham said happened in Abraham's head. So he said that at first he saw three men and ran, whereupon they spoke and were spoken to. He who propounded this allegorical explanation says of Abraham's utterance, in other words, the author of the Torah of Genesis is giving us this allegory, this explanation, and says that Abraham is describing now what happened in Abraham's head. And Abraham said, which is verse 3, which we didn't read, but it's the continuation. And Abraham said, my Adonai, my God, if I have now found favor in your sight, pass not away, I pray you, from your servant. So this is, according to Maimonides, Abraham's dialogue with God in the vision. And what does Maimonides conclude? That it too is a description of what Abraham said to one of them in a vision of prophecy. He says, in fact, Abraham said it to the greatest among them. Understand this story, for it is one of the secrets. Now, you can now understand why Professor Goodman has written an entire book helping us try to understand Maimonides. Because to a certain extent, Maimonides is writing in code. Right? He is not making this easy for us. And why is that the case? Because again, Maimonides is offering us a pretty radical idea, again, radical for maybe the everyday Jewish person of his time, but not radical for the scholars of his time. And he's trying to place Judaism at the forefront of medieval scholarship about God and prophecy. And so he's writing for the best of his students to grapple with this, and so that everybody else looks at this and says, I don't know what he's saying. So if we don't know what Maimonides is saying, that's because we're actually understanding that he's making it complicated on purpose. And so hence why we're reading Professor Goodman to understand what Maimonides is saying. So here is Professor Goodman's explanation. These biblical descriptions enable us to behold, as it were, Abraham's inner visions. Maimonides claims that Jacob's struggle with an angel and the talking donkey in the story of Bilam also only happened in visions, right? So Maimonides is going farther. Maimonides is saying all of these encounters are in the head of the prophet. The category of prophetic vision may be widened to include many other biblical episodes. The scholar Avraham Nuriel maintains that according to Maimonides, even the binding of Isaac only took place in a prophetic vision. Now think about that. That's two people, two major characters, right? Abraham tying Isaac to an altar and then being saved, having Isaac being saved by the interruption of an angel. Maimonides, according to this scholar, Avraham Noriel, is saying, that's only in the head of the prophets. He's saying Abraham did not rise early in the morning or physically saddle his ass or journey for 3 days or actually offer his son on an altar. It all happened. Somebody has a question.
But it's just amazing because we will always struggle with the fact that God tells him to kill his child, and now there is a good explanation.
It's a much better explanation. So Esther asks a very good question, but Jacob got hurt. Jacob wrestled with the angel and he got hurt. How is that in his head? Well, if I wanted to take the strict Maimonidean approach, I could say pretty easily, Jacob had a bout of wrestling and hurt himself. That the internal grappling with God had a physical impact on him. But this thing, absolutely, Amalia, we are into a much better world if we, in fact, imagine Abraham getting the lesson of the binding of Isaac without actually putting Isaac at risk. So it all happened in a vision. This approach empties biblical narratives of historical significance. The prophetic vision is a continuous, symbolic, multivalent phenomenon that transforms biblical narrative from history into literature, from something that really happened into a parable. Maimonides determines that although many of the biblical stories did not actually take place in reality, they are still true because the lessons that emerge from their parables are true. If an event is historical, then it is something that happened in the past. If it is a parable, then it is a story that also happens in the present and the future. Turning story into allegory by placing it in the category of prophetic vision strengthens its meaning and transforms it from an isolated event into a universal truth. So I have been saying something along these lines for years, only remembering a little bit that it actually has its source in Maimonides, which is to say, the power of the Torah is not in its historical truth, but it's in its truth as a teaching. We learn from the Torah not because Moses and the Israelites went to all of those places between Sinai and the Jordan River before they entered into the land of Israel, but rather because the story of their journey is a teaching story. That we don't need to have archaeological evidence of the Exodus from Egypt because the Exodus from Egypt is so much more powerful as a learning story that we tell to one another at every Passover. The Passover Seder itself saying we were slaves and then we were free, the idea that we must create what another scholar has called a moral memory of being oppressed so that our lack of oppression does not turn into oppressing someone else out of vengeance, that this in and of itself is a fundamental moral teaching in Judaism, which is why it's repeated so often in the 5 books of Moses, right? 5 books of Moses repeats, do not oppress the stranger because we were strangers in Egypt, more often than almost any phrase. And why? Not because we remember being in Egypt, but because the teaching about imagining ourselves as oppressed is more powerful than any history could be. Elise says, so people get lost in the stories and miss the moral story of it. Yes. So Maimonides, and Emma says, his determination on biblical stories is very interesting, an idea I've always wondered about. Yeah, absolutely. It turns out if we spend time getting lost in how it really happened, we end up missing the point of the whole, why did we preserve the story for the sake of telling it again anyway? We preserve the stories to teach about who we are and why we should behave better, not to teach about what happened to our ancestors. In fact, let's look at at a Jewish cultural marker in this regard. In Jewish culture, we are very bad biographical historians. Many of us come from places where, regardless of our family backgrounds, we don't have family lineages going back. So Lasan says, does that change all of our holidays remembering these events though? Absolutely not. The holidays that remember our events are meant to use the events as primary teaching moments. Passover is a teaching about freedom, not a teaching about slavery in Egypt. Shavuot is a teaching about the engagement of covenant, about being in relationship with mystery and revelation, and how that impacts how we behave in the present, not an actual giving of law on Sinai. Sukkot is a holiday celebrating the bounty of harvest and recognizing that that bounty is fragile. What's the lesson of Purim? The lesson of Purim is it's really important to have a good time, and that comedy is absolutely necessary. For example, the story of Purim is a farce. It's meant to be read as a farce. The Purim parallel in the Christian world is Fat Tuesday, is Mardi Gras. This is a Dionysian festival. It's a wine drinking festival. Why do we all, yes, getting drunk. Why do we all get drunk at the end of February, beginning of March in this Mediterranean explanation? Because it's when we can see the buds beginning to come out on our grapevines. We can drink up our leftover wine at the end of February, beginning of March, because we see that there will be more wine. It is following the natural harvest agricultural calendar. Why can we make an offering of a lamb at Passover? Because it's the time when we see that the lambs are having babies, the sheep are having babies again, so we know we will have more. We are not asked to make an offering of stuff that we don't have. We are asked to make offerings when we have. Same for Shavuot. Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, 7 weeks after Passover, is the feast of, look, our barley harvest, the winter grain has come in. We can make an offering because we've survived and we know we're going to make it through the summer. Sukkot is the same deal. We've had our harvest, we've brought it in. Now we have enough, God willing, to make it through the winter, but don't get cocky, says Sukkot. Do it in a booth, in a temporary dwelling, in a hut, and remind ourselves of the fragility of life at the same time. The historical nature of the holidays is in fact less important than the thematic nature of the holidays. And why maintain Sukkot when we no longer have harvest? Because it doesn't matter. Is there anybody on this call who harvests all their own food? Anybody here who is entirely sustained by food that you grow yourself?
My mother.
What, Esther?
My mother does that. She has a big garden and she eats everything from her garden.
Right. Does she grow her own grain and grind her own flour? Awesome. So we know one person here who gets it. The rest of us need to be reminded that our food comes from the earth and that it's fragile. So that we as Jews who moved out of the agricultural world into the urban world thousands of years ago still remember that we are tied to a world over which we don't have any control, which is fragile. And Sukkot reminds us of that. Except for Esther's mom, who doesn't need the reminder because she knows if the grain doesn't come in, she's not going to have bread. What I think is so important about this and so relevant is that one doesn't need to swallow one's sense of reason in order to celebrate Jewishly. Rather, being a rationalist is supported by Jewish traditions. And not just because I'm some wacky 21st century rationalist rabbi, but rather because we've been trying to figure out how to update our theology and our philosophy from the get-go. The rabbis of the Talmud did not believe that God was going to save them. Their fundamental grapple is they create all of our texts in response to the destruction of the Second Temple, and they don't believe that any amount of praying is going to bring that temple back. They are coming up with a new system to cope with the fact that we are no longer going to have an offering system focused around offerings at the temple and the Levites and the priesthood. They have to come up with something new. They are grappling with reality as it is facing them, not attempting to pray it out of existence. So here, I imagine, I'm surprised Steve hasn't asked this question, because now we get to the crux of the matter on Mount Sinai. Because what does Maimonides do with this? God's revelation to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai significantly challenges Maimonides' theory of prophecy. If prophecy requires preparation and training, how could a slave people suddenly achieve prophecy in the middle of the desert? For those of you who weren't here for our earlier sessions, one of the key elements of Maimonides in prophecy is he takes a very Aristotelian, a very Greek philosophical view that basically if I perfect myself intellectually, if I perfect myself morally, and if I perfect myself spiritually, I can become a prophet. It is achievable by human gains. Basically, I need to have an imaginative faculty, a spiritual faculty, an intellectual faculty, and a moral faculty. If I perfect those four areas, I can become a prophet. However, how did the Israelites see God in the desert? They were not morally perfect, spiritually perfect, intellectually perfect in any way, shape, or form. Professor Goodman asks even more, if prophecy is attainable only by a few extraordinary individuals, how could it be reached by the entirety of the Jewish people, so many of whom belonged to the quote unquote ignorant masses? Maimonides relies on the rabbinic midrashim, so on midrashic narratives, interpretive stories, narrative forms of rabbinic commentary on the Bible that distinguish between the first two commandments, which were heard by the whole people, and those that followed, which Moses alone received. The difference, according to Maimonides, is that anyone can fully grasp the first two commandments, which express God's existence and unity by means of an entirely rational proof. Okay, so what are we talking about here? First two commandments. For those of you who don't have the 10 utterances in front of you, actually we can go back to Exodus chapter 20 because I will show you something very important. So here we go. Exodus chapter 20 is where the 10 utterances are. We call them the Aseret HaDibrot in Hebrew, which is more like the 10 utterances than the 10 commandments, but we have to capitulate and call them the 10 commandments. They are numbered differently by Jews, by Catholics, and by Protestants. Same text, different enumeration. According to Maimonides, the first commandment is this one, verse 2. Oh, sorry, where did it go? There we go. So verse 2 here is, I am Adonai your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim. That's first commandment according to Maimonides. Now there's a problem for a lot of people because it doesn't seem like a commandment. However, from a Jewish perspective and from Maimonides' perspective, acceptance of the divine is a necessary part of Judaism. So God being God is commandment number 1. So that's how Jews read the Decalogue. If you go to a synagogue and you see it enumerated, Often it is abbreviated just Anochi Adonai, I am God, or just Aleph, depending upon the presentation. So that's commandment number 1. Commandment number 2 is Lo yeh lecha Elohim acharim al, don't have al panai. No, you shall have no other gods before me. So those are the first 2. We're not going to get into the big differences between Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant readings. Are the Christian readings, both the Catholic and the Protestant, start with no other gods before me, besides me, as the first commandment. They don't count verse 2 as a commandment. And then they split up 2 other commandments to get to 10. So the 10th commandment in Judaism is the one about coveting. Catholics are really motivated to not covet, so they split it into don't covet your neighbor's stuff and don't covet your neighbor's people. And Protestants are really motivated against Catholic idolatry, so they split up the no other gods before me into no other gods before me and don't make any graven images, because Luther had a problem with iconography. So same text, different numbers. Anyway, back to Maimonides. So what Maimonides is saying is anyone can grasp those 2. You don't need to be a prophet to know that. So the hoi polloi, the ignorant, quote unquote, ignorant masses, all the Jews get those 2. Not so, however, not only that, because it's entirely rational. That there is one God and there are no other gods makes explicit sense. It is possible to express that from Maimonides' perspective in a theoretical proof. However, not with the later commandments. What does Maimonides say about that? The sages have a dictum formulated in several passages of the Midrashim of these collected stories and also in the Talmud. This is their dictum. They, meaning the Israelites, heard I, meaning I am Adonai your God, and thou shalt not, no other gods before me, from the mouth of God, God's self, from the mouth of the Mighty One. They mean that these words reached them just as they reached Moses, our master, and that it was not Moses who communicated them to them. For these 2 principles, I mean the existence of the deity and God's being one, are knowable by human speculation alone. Now, with regard to anything that can be known by demonstration, the status of the prophet and anyone else who knows it are equal. There is no superiority of one over the other. Thus, these 2 principles are not known through prophecy alone. The text of the Torah says, unto you it was shown in Deuteronomy. So everybody saw this. As for the other commandments, they belong to the class of generally accepted opinions and those adopted in virtue of tradition, not to the class of intellecta, meaning that which can be proven. So one doesn't need to be a prophet to see that God is God and God is one. That's so obvious that anybody showing up can have that vision of God. The rest of the revelation requires prophetic insight. And if you're saying Maimonides is splitting hairs here, you are right. Maimonides is coming up with a historic justification based on Jewish traditional readings of these texts to argue his point. Because this encounter with the divine is not in accord with the rest of the things Maimonides says about prophecy. So it's not that Maimonides is coming up with something whole cloth. Maimonides is using an accepted interpretive tradition over the 1,000 years prior to him that says, and it's borne out by the Israelites' interactions at that time, because the Israelites say pretty quickly on, Moses, we're too terrified of God, you go talk to God. because seeing the way the universe works is frightening. To have the prophetic insight into the way things actually work could be not merely awe-inspiring, but terrifying. And so it's left for the prophet to have that communication and bring it to the rest of us. Here is Professor Goodman's explanation of that moment. The Jewish people, according to Maimonides, experienced a moment of philosophical illumination, but not prophecy. The revelation at Sinai proved God's existence, God's incorporeality, and God's unity, right? So God exists, God is not physical, and God is singular. So Elise asks, but does Maimonides believe Abraham's experience with God was a parable too? Absolutely. Absolutely. All of these prophetic experiences are not diminished by the fact that they take place inside the head of the prophet. Rather, they are more powerful because they are insights into the way things actually work. So what is the product of that particular encounter between Abraham and God? The idea that God has shared with Abraham that Abraham, despite all appearances, will still have a son with Sarah, right? That's the message of that encounter. Now, it would take some, not just faith, but some great medical insight for Abraham to not only believe, but know that he will still have a child with Sarah after all their years of failed attempts. Similarly, what's the point of Abraham's encounter with God that leads to, in his head, that leads to the sacrifice of Isaac? That's a longer explanation, but I would say at the very basic level, it reminds us as parents that no matter how difficult parenting is, we don't get to sacrifice our kids. You know, there are moments in parenting that none of us are proud of, where, you know, or let me speak of my own experience as a child from many, many moons ago, when I came home at an unreasonable time in the middle of the night. My mother said to me, "I am so happy you're alive, I could kill you." And that is exactly the type of thing one would expect from a parent, where we create so much level of frustration, we incur that level of wrath. We don't know what led Abraham to be tempted to think that Isaac's death was something that God could want. But we certainly do know that it's unlikely for him to have come to that just because God said so. Yeah, Bob says we've all heard that. Yes, absolutely. And so the idea is there's something complicated going on. And what Abraham's vision allows us to understand is to enter into that complexity. And it becomes an allegory from which we might learn how to behave better. Because of course, what's the point of Torah but to help us figure out how to behave better? So the revelation at Sinai proves God's existence, incorporeality, and unity. Those three ideas: God's real, God's non-physical, and God is singular. Maimonides believed that such proofs, although complex, were accessible to everyone, to the masses. He even presented one such proof, as we saw above, in the first chapter of the Mishnah Torah, when he determined that knowledge of God was incumbent on the whole Jewish people. Maimonides' understanding of the Sinai moment reflects his trust in the potential for democratizing philosophy, even as he rules out the possibility of democratizing prophecy. So this is a key element here. Everybody can access, with enough help, philosophical truths, but not everybody may be good enough to access prophetic truths. Oh, Bob, yes, Abraham was a prophet. All of the patriarchs are prophets. They don't have prophetic books, but Moses is a prophet, is the essential prophet. So Moses closes the 5 books of Moses era of prophecy. Prophecy never reaches the level of Moses afterwards. The books of prophets is a designation, both time period and thematically. Okay, Steve asks, way off topic, but after last night's session, I did some additional research and came across a term that I didn't know, psek resha, which I think means unintended consequences when I was asking about loopholes. Then I found some unusual references, like cutting off a chicken's head for a child to use as a toy is prohibited on Shabbat, because even if the intention was to make a toy, one would still be killing an animal, which is prohibited on Shabbat. Just wondering if Maimonides had insights on this. You're right, this is way off topic. We're not going to talk about that, Maimonides and halacha in this either. And Amalia points out absolutely correctly, Sarah was a prophet as well, for sure. There's no doubt that not only Sarah has visions, but many women in the Torah and have insights into the way the world works. For example, one might take the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers as people who see that something is wrong with the law and thus go about fixing it by protesting. So a prophetic truth is an insight into the way things work or don't work. Hagar as well. Hagar has a lot of conversation with the divine. So the rationalization of prophecy, according to Maimonides, makes prophecy available by our own merits, as to be distinguished in this last statement from philosophy, which everyone can access intellectually. If I study enough, I'm going to access intellectual truths. There's no amount of studying that's going to provide me what Maimonides talks about with regard to an imaginative faculty that can imagine into the world a better view of things, right? That's going to have to be some sort of inherited ability. And so Maimonides creates this system where there is really a whole lot of access in a way that we might have thought was not before. I want to close on one particular thought, though, with regard to that. I would like to propose the idea that Judaism itself is a constant move towards figuring out how more Jews can do more of Judaism. And for Exhibit A, I'll trot out my favorite example of this, which is the rabbinic model. The system that the rabbis come up with is accessible to all Jews, which is different from the model that preceded them, which could only be done by priests. That the majority of Jewish worship, one would say the entirety of Jewish worship, was done by somebody on our behalf, right? We had somebody, a go-between between ourselves and the divine when we brought offerings to the temple, and the priest had to offer up our offerings on our behalf. The rabbis created a system where prayer and assembly in a synagogue replaces worship in the temple, but even more so, as I've said any number of times, on Passover, the head of the household, regardless of heritage, stands in place of the priest as officiating at a sacrificial meal, a celebratory meal, which is not meant to be the Paschal lamb, right? There is a tradition among some Jews not to eat lamb on Passover for exactly this reason, because we don't want to seem like we are replacing the sacrificial system. And so our table becomes a stand-in for the altar. The head of household, regardless of gender or heritage, becomes the stand-in for the priest. And the Passover Seder itself is the stand-in for the sacrifice. The offering and the meal and the eating of the Paschal lamb is replaced by a meal with structure and memory and storytelling, because we're not painting blood on our doors, thank God. I mean, talk about a reason for Jews not to be accepted as neighbors. If sometime on the week before Easter, all of us, were slaughtering sheep in our backyard and taking sheep's blood and painting it on our doors, we could understand why maybe some people wouldn't want us as neighbors. So fortunately, we've moved on from that. But what we really did was the rabbis took Judaism out of the temple and put it into our homes and into synagogues. They took Jewish expertise out of the priesthood and made it available to anybody who could learn. And if we think of the debate between Hillel and Shammai about who can become Jewish and what qualifications they need to have, Hillel says anybody who wants to can become Jewish. Shammai says no. Hillel's view is accepted, and as there is a person on Twitter who tweets as Shammai, and who in Shammai's voice reminded us all that even though Hillel and Shammai disagreed about who could become Jewish, once Hillel made new Jews, Shammai accepted them. So could you imagine what a beautiful lesson that is for us today, where we are still arguing over whether or not this rabbi or that cantor or this group or that group can make new Jews. And instead say, you know what? Somebody who's crazy enough to want to become Jewish like us, we welcome you.
What was Shammai's excuse?
What, Amalia?
What was Shammai's excuse for not accepting everybody who wants to be Jewish?
Oh, because they made absurd questions, right? Hillel made incredibly flexible accommodations, right? One of those Jews wanted to become Jewish, providing they could wear the garb of the high priest. But there's no way, because not only could a convert not become high priest, right? I couldn't become high priest, and I'm Jewish, right? Only somebody who's descended from Aaron can become high priest. One of the Jews said, teach me only according to the written law, not the oral law. And the other said, providing you can teach me all of Torah while standing on one foot, right? That's the famous one. All three of these people had gone to Shammai first, and Shammai threw a 2x4 at them. Literally, Shammai had a builder's level, right? The way you used to do level in the ancient world is you put a big piece of wood, a straight piece of wood on a string, right? So when you hung it in the center, you could see what level was. And Shammai had a day job as a builder. So these three people went to Shammai first, and what did Shammai do when they asked him these absurd questions? Is he threw something at them and said, "Gay avec," in the language of the old country, right? Go away. And they went to Hillel, and Hillel said, "Okay, I'll convert you right now, right here and now. No baked in, no year of study, no evaluation. You've said this crazy thing that you want to become high priest. Convert with me, providing you come back with me and learn tomorrow."
Now I learned that Shammai also knew Yiddish.
Well, let's say that I took a little historical license there.
Jonathan,
Yes.
when Moses is up on the mountain and he's getting the 10 commandments and he is the intermediary.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And I'll be down at a certain time, but was delayed 6 hours. And that's when the calf was built. These people still needed something physical to see.
Right, which is why we end up with the Mishkan. Because we have to bring God with us. We have to bring Sinai with us. Because it turns out, just like Maimonides, who comes up with a very abstract idea of God, understood that not everybody could cope with that. They needed a much more tangible concept of the divine. So for Maimonides, we've got philosophers who get what's going on, and the rest of us schlubs who, need to feel like God is taking care of us a little bit more directly. And what I would like to offer is that the power of Jewish community life is that we take care of each other, that we become the presence of the divine in the world when we act more appropriately, when we act more righteously, when we act with greater compassion, when we act more lovingly. That it is upon us to bring God into the world through our actions, through us working together communally, because what we continue to understand over and over again is anything that I can do myself can be done not just better with somebody else, but much more than addition better. It's not my actions plus your actions mean twice as many actions. It's my actions and your actions coordinated mean much more than twice as much the impact. And that is the presence of the divine, the miraculousness that, in fact, two people working together are much greater than the sum of their parts. And with that, I'm going to say farewell, everyone. I have an appointment at the DMV today. I'm going to the DMV in person, masked and all that, to renew my driver's license and get an enhanced ID. So that at some point, optimistically, I might be able to take a plane or cross a border.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all so much. It's a pleasure seeing all of you, and I look forward to it. We're taking off next week, but come back in 2 weeks.